My name is Jan Hewley. I'm a retired Lieutenant General in the United States Marines, and I am the current President and CEO of the Marines Memorial Association and Foundation, and I'm honored tonight to be addressing you. The 17th of September, 1947, is the day the Air Force was founded. It's my honor tonight, to be able to introduce our moderator. Heroes. We're going to talk about a hero tonight. We've all had heroes in life. My first hero was my dad, Sergeant Major in the Marine Corps, Marine Raider in the Second World War, Company First Sergeant of a rifle company in Korea, and a Sergeant Major in Vietnam. He was my first hero. Then when I got in the Marines, I met a lot of heroes. Medal of Honor recipients, Navy Cross recipients, people that guided me that just were never probably recognized for the deeds that they did, but they taught me. The people that I work with that helped me, the subordinates that I had that picked me up and dusted me off and forgave me my sins when I erred. Heroes. We got another hero here tonight, a guy that I've learned to be a hero in the last year. And that's our moderator tonight, Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Tice. Now, he's not just a hero in my mind because he was an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. We fought in the same war together. I didn't see his plane go down, but, he was there, and he got to be a member of Saddam Hussein's Crossbar Hotel for a number of months, or days at least. But that's not why he's my hero. Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Tice, U.S. Air Force retired, is my hero because what he continues to do for us today. He is supporting this event tonight as the moderator, but he also is supporting it financially, and he has supported so many things for the Marines Memorial that I can't count them. But I enjoy having him as a member of our board of directors. He's a real contributor, and I think Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Tice deserves a nice round of applause. Your moderator. Jeff, thank you.
Well, sir, thank you. I try not to use the H word around myself. It's kind of embarrassing. But I'll add my welcome to everyone for another Meet the Author event here at the Marines Memorial Club and Association. As far as I'm concerned, these are some of the most interesting and enriching programs that we do here at the Memorial Club. However, as General Hooley just mentioned, this is probably going to be a little bit different because not only is the subject matter, the author, and the moderator are all members of the most junior service in our uniformed services. So that's probably the first time that's ever happened at one of these Meet the Author events, as far as I can recall. Without any further ado, Chief Master Sergeant Proietti joined the Air Force in 1984, and he went into the public affairs career field. And he's worked and works primarily as a print journalist for the Air Force now. In 2008, he was running the Air Force news team in Washington, D.C., when a rumor of Chief Master Sergeant Etchberger posthumously being awarded a Medal of Honor 40 years later kind of showed up on his desk. Well, in typical E8, well, I think you were E7 back then, E7, E8 fashion, he tried to talk one of his junior staffers into taking the story and running with it. However, they talked, well, I think whining is probably a better appropriate term. They whined him into taking the lead on this fascinating tale. And it's a tale of family, secrecy, and heroism. And the book that was born out of this tale is an intriguing story called At All Costs. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce the author, Chief Master Sergeant Matt Proietti. Here you go, Matt.
Good job. You said my name perfectly. I said it incorrectly till I was like in 6th grade. I used to say Proietti, and then my dad said, you don't pronounce our name correctly. Hey, about that thing about the Air Force being the youngest service, I wrote a commentary for the Air Force website a few years ago talking about, while that's true, I like to trace our heritage all the way back. We were born from the Army, and we're going back to the wearing the same fatigues as the Army right now, as a matter of fact. But I like to think that during the Civil War they had the balloons, so that was aviation. So And then, well, if you don't want to say the Air Force was born back that far, how about the 1st Reconnaissance Squadron that the Army had in the I think 1913 or 1911. Well, that's still in service today up at Beale Air Force Base. So that's an Air Force unit. So we can certainly go back before 47. Thank you for the chance to come here and talk about Chief Etchberger, one of the only, probably the only reason I would not be watching the Boston Red Sox game in my hotel room right now is to talk about Chief Etchberger, a man who I greatly admire. But thank you for the nice introduction, Colonel Tice, and thank you, Mackenzie, for setting this up. We've been talking to each other for maybe 6 months or more about to have this schedule work out. So we have a format set up here. Colonel Tice and I talked last week about how to do this, and I'm going to try to stick to what we agreed to. We have some Q&As that we agreed on, questions and answers I already provided. We're going to stick with that a little bit, and then we'll open it up to the floor. But I think the easiest way for me not to cover what the colonel's going to ask me in questions is for me to sort of talk to the slide over here. I only have 2 slides. In the military, we call this death by PowerPoint. Well, not tonight. There's only 2 slides. So that is Chief Master Sergeant Richard L. Etchberger, or everyone called him Dick or Etch. That picture was taken sometime within the last 3 months of his life. I was killed in March of 1968, along with 11 other airmen, the greatest loss of ground forces for the Air Force in the Vietnam War. So that picture right there is taken at Udorn Air Base, or Udorn, however you want to pronounce it. Everybody disagrees. The people that were stationed there disagree. But that's in Thailand, and the crew that he was on would be working 2 weeks on a hill up in Laos, and we'll get into that, and 2 weeks off. And so this is obviously the off time. Chief Etchberger, a nice-looking gentleman there. My wife came up with the phrase that I use in the book, and she says he's conventionally handsome. And I'm like, ooh, that's good. Like, it took me maybe 24 years, I think, something like that. And a couple of things have to line up, especially reserves is different than active duty and everything. But you can make it as fast as 15 years. He made it in like 15 years. And he was a great GI, not even talking about the stuff he did to warrant the Medal of Honor. Just the discipline and the way he ran his life and career is what interested me about him. To be able to have a whole career to look at, because he had been in the Air Force for 15 and a half years before he was killed, so he was a great airman. One thing I don't think we did talk about, sir, was he actually was accepted to the Air Cadet program, which was high school graduates where you're already in the Air Force. You could apply, the sharpest folks could apply to be trained as pilots, and then you'd finish your bachelor's degree later or something like that. Well, he was accepted to that, and then he did very well in his training, but he had an accident playing soccer, just a pickup game in his hometown in Pennsylvania, and he had a concussion from that, which he didn't really fully admit to the Air Force doctors, and he got accepted into the program, and then when he was flying and got up to a certain altitude, he started having some behavioral issues and unfortunately washed out of the program, which if you can all remember what it's like to be 20 years old and you join the service and you're going to be an electronics expert, and then they dangle this flying career in front of you, and you go off and academically, you have no problems with it, and then your body lets you down, and that must have been quite a blow to the young Chief Etchberger, Airman Etchberger. So this is the second slide, just for the folks who don't know. Now, number one, I've been asked a few times by people who obviously probably weren't around during the Vietnam War. They asked me like where I was stationed, and I said, well, I was born in 1966, so I wasn't stationed anywhere in the. I wrote a book about the Vietnam War, but I was what, 18 months old when Chief Etchberger was killed. What you're looking at there is a in northeastern Laos, you can see where it says Proietti. Pu is the Lao word for mountain, so that's like Mount Pati. That's where this radar site was set up that Chief Etchberger was the senior enlisted person on. Over to the right, the picture, you can see, that's an actual picture of it. And now it's crazy because with the internet, I mean, every few months I'll Google Proietti or Lima Site 85, which was the CIA name for the site here. There's more and more videos. People go, over there, go ride mountain bikes here now and stuff. So it's crazy. I still haven't visited, neither have any of Chief Etchberger's sons. We're hoping to get over there in the next few years. In the bottom right, you'll see that picture of the big cliff face. That is plays a huge role in what we'll get to later, talking about the North Vietnamese Army attack on Lima Site 85. But look at that cliff. I mean, that's like something down out of Yosemite. That's from like the 1990s or something. I don't think that's taken back back in 1967 or 68. So you can see the setup there. Back to the map. Proietti was where they would go work. They chose this site for this radar operation, and we'll get into the what the radar allowed them to do. We'll get into that a little bit later. But they chose that site right there because for the radar to work at its greatest capability, it had to be within 200 miles of its target, and that's why it's so close. You can see Hanoi right there. The Proietti is like maybe 12 to 15 or 16 miles from the North Vietnamese border, maybe 150 miles as the crow flies to Hanoi. Down below, you can see Vientiane. That's where the U.S. Embassy was, still is after many years. We didn't have relations with them for years, and we normalized relations, and we're back to, we've had an embassy there for many, many years. That plays a pretty key role in the story of this mission, Project Heavy Green, because it was really the top person there was the ambassador. It called most of the shots. The one thing that I want to, I've got a few points that we're not going to cover that I've missed in the past at previous speaking engagements, but the Medal of Honor, one person who was really responsible for getting the word out there about what Chief Etchberger had done was a gentleman, is a retired master sergeant named Robert Dilley, and he's works for a railroad now. But he did the same job as Chief Etchberger, but not at the same time. Chief Etchberger was killed in March of 1968. Robert was in junior high then or something, and he was in from, say, 73 to 93 or something like that. But he had, with chat rooms, when the internet kind of blew up and everyone started getting, computer internet service at your home in the mid-90s, all those chat rooms started with people with shared interests. And so he was one of those people who was talking about their job. It's called radar bomb scoring. And they talked about, hey, did you ever hear about this stuff that went on in Laos? And you couldn't talk about it because it was classified. We weren't supposed to be in Laos. The North Vietnamese weren't supposed to be in Laos. We were in Laos, so it was declassified quietly in the 80s. But so what Robert Dilley did was he sat around up at in front of his computer, and he's reading these actions, and he's like, well, this is like Medal of Honor type stuff. And he didn't just shut down his computer and say, too bad for that guy. He wouldn't let it go. So what he did, Robert lives in North Dakota, and Chief Etchberger was stationed in North Dakota for like 5 or 6 years in the I think 1960 to 65 in Bismarck. So there was a North Dakota connection there from the Master Sergeant Dilley and Chief Etchberger. A third of his career was spent in North Dakota. So what Master Sergeant Dilley did was he wrote his congressman a letter, and then he went to a public appearance where the congressman was going to be welcoming the National Guard. They were either going off to Iraq or Afghanistan, a Middle East deployment, 10, probably 13 years ago now or something. He went to where this congressman was he must have read in the newspaper or something, congressman's going to be at this thing. And he walked right up to the congressman and handed him this letter. and said, "Sir, I think you ought to look into this." And to the congressman's credit, like within a month, he had appointed an aide to look into this thing. And that really was, the story was already out there among a very small group of people. But getting a Medal of Honor for someone who's been dead for 42 years, you know, there's rules, there's guidelines, and those guidelines, there's ways to get those guidelines waived, but they have to be, you have to go through all those steps. And it took a lot of work. The Air Force had to appoint a committee, you know, to go look into it, and then the Secretary of the Air Force has to agree, yes, I'm going to nominate him for this. And then it has to go through the rest of the DOD and the White House and all that sort of stuff. But Bob Dilley, to me, he's a hero of mine, because he just did it. He just did what he thought was right. And if you met Bob, he's just a good old boy, you know, from Minnesota, or some small town in Minnesota. It's not even on the map, but lives in North Dakota. But he would wave that off. But I really believe that if he didn't act then, Chief Etchberger might have got the Medal of Honor, but he wouldn't have got it in 2010. It would have taken someone else to have to bring it to a congressman's attention, who brought it. You know, when the congressman calls the Secretary of the Air Force, it's different than if I walk in there, or you know, somebody writes the Secretary of the Air Force and says, look at it. So when two congressmen from North Dakota and then a congressman, he went and they did a united effort with the congressman who represents Chief Etchberger's hometown of Hamburg, Pennsylvania. So I want to give some credit to Robert Dilley right there. But and this mission started in late September, early October of 1967. So there was 450,000 American troops in Southeast Asia then. It was a big year of, it had grown, you know, in the previous 18 months or so, a lot. So we lost 6,350 people there died, Americans died in Vietnam War in 1966. 6,350, 11,000 in 67. The book title comes from, At All Costs, comes from the importance of this mission, and we'll talk about this attack in a little bit, but it actually was orders from a general to hold that site at all costs. And that's where I thought it was a perfect title, frankly. I dedicated my book to America's Vietnam War veterans, specifically because, you know, I've been in a long time, but not, I remember in the 80s when I joined, there was still a sort of pallor over the military service or something. I mean, I knew it, but I didn't know it as a young man. But like nowadays, my friend Lieutenant Colonel Higgs in the back, he can tell you, now you wear your uniform, it's like, you know, I flew from Charleston the other day to Sacramento, and everybody stops you and thanks you for your service and everything. And I know that didn't happen. And one of the most emotional things for me is, like, I live up by Grass Valley, and I'll see a 4th of July parade, and Vietnam Veterans of America have an entry in it, and everyone stands and applauds them and things like that. And that's why I dedicated the book to them, because if any of you were there and came back and dealt with the kind of reception you got, it's disgraceful in my opinion, and everybody has to live with their own actions in that time. I want to give credit to President Johnson, the library staff. When I went down to there in Austin, about 10 years ago now or so, I showed up and I was in Austin on a day off, and I was in flip-flops, probably hadn't shaved, and a t-shirt and shorts, and I went in there to ask about how you do research. And they said, well, come on in. And I said, no, not today. I'll come back in a week or two. I was doing some duty for the Air Force in San Antonio. And they said, oh, don't be ridiculous. You know, it's a college town. So they said, come on in here, because the guy that was in charge there was a guy named John Wilson, and he was in that day. And he welcomed me in. They said, you better talk to him. He's in today, and he's busy, and he travels a lot. So I did, and he pointed me. He didn't point me in the right direction. He just opened up this is where you need to be, and gave me all the research stuff. And it's fascinating to look at all. You can kind of you can kind of get off the target when you start researching stuff. There's so many fascinating things and transcripts of meetings with President Johnson's cabinet and things like that. It has nothing to do with the book. And next thing you know, you're like, oh, I have to stop this and get back to the story. But it's really interesting stuff. But it's not stuff, I didn't discover anything that other people hadn't already seen. But it was interesting to be there anyway.
Hey, Matt, thanks. Thanks very much. What I really would, before we start actually getting into my questions to you, can you give us just a quick synopsis of the mission? 2 to 5 minutes of what went on, and then we'll go into questions. How's that?
Absolutely. So when I get to 5 minutes, because I can talk about it for 20, when I get to 5, just kind of go like that. So the mission, Project Heavy Green, these men were all, and they were career GIs. None of them were draftees. They were professional GIs who'd been in probably from 4 or 5 years up to 20 years at that time. But the mission was, they were all in this career field called radar bomb scoring. And that had been around. They've been using it in this particular way it wasn't new. It wasn't new in 1967. They'd been doing it for probably 15 years or something like that. And what it was, and I'm no radar expert, but to me it's like, okay, radar shows where something is, you can go there and you can drop your bombs on it, which is, yeah, okay, that's sort of true. But what we were doing in the Air Force, and probably the other services too, was we were using it like in reverse. So we were leading pilots to a particular place, to a drop zone, and we would tell, like I was there, they would tell, the GIs would have this radar equipment and an early computer, and they had a whole system set up in trailers that were portable. And what they would do was they would tell the pilots to fly at a certain speed, at a certain altitude, and knowing the ballistics of the bombs that were on those particular aircraft, they could tell them, if you want to hit this, X, and they practiced like up in, the middle of nowhere in South Dakota and down in Texas and all over the place. Well, they would tell the pilots that, and it worked. So they'd say, drop down to this altitude, slow down to this much, speed up to that much, and they knew the size of the bomb, so they knew where the spot was. They were seeing it on their computer, and they would, they'd have the boss, the officer in charge of the enlisted men, would be on the radio, and would take over. Like when the pilot was maybe a minute away or 2 minutes away or something like that, they would actually take over and be on the mic, and they would tell the pilots when to drop the stuff. So now, do you want to share a little of he mentioned to me that he had some experience with this same thing.
Well, you're absolutely right. The radar bomb scoring system has been around since the late 50s, and you made a very precise description of what it was. And what it was used for in this case was we reversed it. So you think about it, I know where an airplane is in space via the radar. I know where my target is on the ground via geographic references. Remember, this is well before GPS, laser-guided bombs, or anything like that. And I know where I am on the ground, and I can draw a line between all three of those. It's a classic geometry of triangulation. I can get things really accurate to one point or any of the 3 points that I want on my triangle. Well, it's a little more complicated than that because a bomb doesn't fall in a straight line, all those kind of things. So there's a little bit of algorithms, and the very early computer was used to actually predict where that bomb was going to go. And it was very accurate from the sense that before this was put into place, it was a gravity experiment. The guys would get to a point in space, we called it pickle off. You pickle off your bombs, and sure, they're going to hit the ground precisely where. That's why you drop a bunch of them, not just one, because you want to make sure the effects are going to take place. And so with this system, we were able to target things very, very accurately and do it in bad weather, which was something that the enemy always used to their advantage. They knew prior to this system coming into use that they could get away with rebuilding things during bad weather and making it worse and worse. So once once this system was put into use in Vietnam, before laser-guided bombs, it became very accurate. And of course, the enemy took notice that, wait a minute, all of a sudden they're dropping bombs in bad weather. I wonder what's happening. And we got into that situation. But yes, Matt, you're absolutely right. I do have some experience with this because we used to practice it all the time in the same methods that you were talking about. You know, we didn't always get to go drop live bombs. We dropped electrons, and they would actually score it because they knew where we were. They knew what we were trying to do. They knew the ballistics of the bomb. We would hit a pickle button. It would send a tone. They would record that tone, and they would know whether or not we were accurate or not accurate. And you get a score back from this. Well, they just reversed engineered it, and they used it to actually direct where that bomb was going to fall pretty accurately, considering a lot of things that were going on from a high altitude bombing situation. Continue on with the story. It's great.
What he said, yeah, great.
No, continue on with this.
But it's fascinating to me to have a pilot sitting here who actually used the system, because all I did was interview people about it and that sort of thing, and I never saw it actually in play. But yeah, it was around for years, and so the reason these so it was about 30 men were identified. This came from way up high in DOD. And the White House in 1967, and the plan for it was already months and months old before they ever even asked or told the guys, you know, they were going to be going over to Laos. So how that came about was, you know, the North Vietnam, you know, we were there, we were slugging it out with them, and maybe you were there then, and you know way better than I do, but. You know, they weren't agreeing to come to the bargaining table, so the plan was, well, let's hit them hard and, you know, force them to capitulate, you know, come to the table at least, and let's wrap this thing up, which of course did not happen. But that was the plan, and so they had a meeting down at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. They called in all these folks and told them, hey, the commander of it, who passed away maybe 5 years ago, Colonel Jerry Clayton, was there and said, you're going to be, you've been offered an opportunity here. You need to volunteer. But before you can find out anything about it, you have to volunteer, which they did. I mean, you can imagine there's a room full of people, and they volunteered, and then when they all volunteered and they locked the doors and they said, yeah, okay, now here's what you're doing. And what they were doing was, okay, who can tell me about Laos? And that's when, I mean, the people there knew we weren't supposed to be in Laos, but that was the information. And boy, they were on the ground there like within weeks. I mean, from that meeting, they were on the ground there probably 3 weeks later, maybe, something very fast. And in the meantime, they actually got invited. They could bring their wives. It was all men. They could bring their wives to Washington, D.C. to learn about the mission. And the women were sworn to secrecy. And Chief Etchberger's wife really took that to heart. She really didn't talk about it with her sons for years and decades and everything like that. But so they went over and started work. I mean, they got to Southeast Asia. It had already been set up. Another team had gone in there ahead of time, and the Navy explosives team went up to that mountain, and they leveled it off. And so there wasn't any surprise that the enemy knew. I mean, the CIA had a location up there. That's one of the most important things. They had been there since at least 1965, at least 2 years, 2.5 years, maybe 3. And they had a little landing site there. And the Air America people, pilots would fly out. You know, they would fly supplies out into the rural areas and try to do good things for the natives there or whatever. And so it was known. Lima Site 85. Lima Site just meant LS, meant like landing strip. And it was at the top of this mountain, about 5,000 foot elevation. That cliff is 2,500 or 3,000 feet straight up. And they went to work, and I mean, they landed over there at Udorn, and they split into 2 groups, and they went up, and they were working like that night. I mean, everything was set up, and the equipment, they all were experts in it. So for them, there wasn't any learning period when they were there. When they showed up, Colonel Clayton told me, he said, I think we did missions that night. They flew up and started doing bombing runs. So that sets up what they're doing up there.
Let me just ask a couple quick questions, and we'll go from there, and we'll get a chance to talk to folks in the audience after this. So, obviously, when this landed on your desk, you were trying to pass it off to somebody else, but once you had a chance to look at it a little bit more closely, what gave you the sense that the initial story was more than just a story, it was actually going to be a book?
Yeah, you're right. It was, it did come down to, we had to look into this guy's life. I was there, I was in my role as a GI. I was running the Air Force news team for about 5 months. The Air Force, in its wisdom, the full-time guy that was there running the team got, orders to leave, and the guy that was succeeding him wasn't coming in for 6 months. So there was a little perfect gap in there, and it was a dream job for me. I loved it. But I did try to get trying to be a good leader, I did try to get my 3 writers under me, each of them to take it on. One of them had just come back from a deployment and was sort of burned out at the moment. Another one was about 8.5 months pregnant, didn't care about Air Force history at the moment. And the other one just whatever. They actually told me one meeting, we had a staff meeting, and I went in, and I was getting a little ticked off with them, because I was an E8, I was a senior master sergeant at the time. I was like, I didn't think you could tell me no. And, but they said, why don't you do it? And all of them agreed. And I said, oh, apparently there's already been a staff meeting this morning. So I said, well, I'm not going to let you phone it in. I'm not going to let you do a disservice to the story. Because what I was suggesting was, hey, take a Friday off and drive up to Chief Etchberger's hometown and poke around, all kind of shoe leather journalism. And so I did. I went up there. My wife accompanied me, and we drove up there. And somehow I had connected with 2 of Chief Etchberger's high school classmates, a man and a woman. And the woman June had a Chief Etchberger was their first classmate who died. So it really was a shock. He was their class president. I mean, he was like a perfect young man, class president, lead actor in the plays, all this stuff, good athlete and everything like that. So I went up and met them, and to hear how, they were talking about him as, 16-year-old Etch. They weren't talking about him like Medal of Honor recipient or whatever. They didn't know him in that role. It didn't surprise them that when it came out what his actions were, it didn't surprise him that he had done that. He obviously was a great young man. So when I went to that hometown, and I thought, okay, it'll be a story. And then I went, and I was like, oh, this is fascinating. This is going to be 3 stories. And then what happened was my tour ended up there in Washington, D.C. There was no rush for me to get this done, because we didn't know if he was going to be nominated. My boss had just said, hey, go find out in case he's nominated. This was August of 2008. He was nominated. I left Washington at the end of September, the end of the fiscal year. And then he was nominated in October of 2008 by the Secretary of the Air Force. But it takes a long time. President George W. Bush was leaving. President Obama came in. But it takes a while to get through the pile of stuff that's on your desk, I guess. It was like 2 years later. So I didn't do any of the writing. I took that one day, and then I started rolling around in my brain. I'll deal with it in the fall on my own time, which is what I did. And then what took it from that, a 3-part series about his life, to a book was Chief Etchberger's son, Corey, heard I was poking around about his dad, and I don't even know how this happened, to be honest with you. Had my email address or something. He was living in Switzerland at the time and sent me an email. And we started, emailing each other back and forth. And then Corey eventually asked me, he said, I'm toying with the idea of writing a book about my dad. Would you help me with that? Do you have time to help me with that? And Corey is a biology professor. He's a turtle expert. He's not a writer. He writes research papers about mating habits of turtles or something like that. So he invited me to be his partner on the project, and we actually toyed with the idea, which now looking back it's like that could never work, but I was going to write typical like 3rd-person style, and Corey was going to write 1st-person style. And then after 6 months, we just realized it'd be better if I just handled it from a kind of professionally distant stance and just do research on my own and include his memories. He was only 8 or 9 when his dad died. He didn't really have that many memories. He could talk about the ramifications of losing a dad that early in his life. But so yeah, Corey invited me. I always say this, and Corey knows I do. Corey invited me to be part of his project, and then I fired him from the project about 6 months or a year into it. And I think it's better because of that. It's not written by a family member. I'm a little more dispassionate about it, even though I think his dad's fantastic.
Chief Etch was involved in the Heavy Green project, which was highly classified. It was probably above top secret in some areas. And with that in mind, I mean, how did that affect your research when you finally realized that, hey, this guy was involved in something really classified? So how did all this affect with your research to finish the book?
Well, it didn't really affect it at all because it had been declassified, I think, in 1983. Maybe 15 years was the waiting period. But when they declassify something, I said, it's not like they call up the Washington Post, and bring them a box of stuff. Hey, write about this, or the New York Times. No, it's declassified. But then they wait for people to come poking around and do Freedom of Information Act requests and that sort of stuff. So it was, I mean, I didn't hear his name. I joined in '84, and I heard his name in '08, so 24 years. So even though it was declassified, like Chief Etchberger got the Air Force Cross posthumously, 10 months after he was killed. His wife received it. And, but he wasn't on the Air Force Cross list. Like, we go through professional military education. If you look at stuff, even from the 90s, I've got some old magazines, and I look up, and his name's not on it. It was clandestine. It wasn't talked about. Even though it was declassified, it takes a while for that to get out. But like NBC knew about it. Somebody wrote a story about it, like in 1970, and it's pretty darn accurate. Some print journalist on the ground there. I've got a copy of the article. It's probably 2/3 accurate. And when the Air Force isn't talking about it, it was pretty impressive reporting, pretty accurate. So,
along with the research, when you started the program of researching, it was 2008, 2009. Chief Etch got asked, listen to me, got awarded an Air Force Cross in secret.
Right.
And then he was upgraded to an MOH. Maybe in 2010 was when it was first.
Yeah, he got the Medal of Honor. President Obama presented it in September of 2010.
Do you think any of your research aided in that, in that transition from an Air Force Cross to the upgrade?
No. It was already, the train had really left the station. The Air Force came to me and told me, hey, look into it. And then, but I always like to give credit, besides Master Sergeant Dilley, the gentleman who wrote the letter and brought it, hand-delivered it to the congressman, there's another book about this mission that's called One Day Too Long. And it's written by a retired Air Force officer named Dr. Tim Castle. He's a professor. That's where the doctor comes from. Dr. Castle's book is a real scholarly look into Project Heavy Green's role in the North Vietnamese Air War. And he was doing that stuff like, I don't know if he started in the late 80s, but in the 90s, and the book came out about 98 or 99. And it's a big, thick book, but if anyone's interested in looking at the deeper aspect of it, I highly recommend that book. And I think that book, and that book came out, and then it's not just a book comes out and poof, Chief Etchberger gets the Medal of Honor. I mean, the book came out, it gets known, and it's slow. The buildup is slow. These people that were in the chat rooms were already talking about it. The book comes out, and then it's still years later that this all came. But I think that those things all happened early on, and they led up to that. But so Dr. Castle's research, so he was kind of in the blind there. He was researching before like the chat room stuff was going on. So
let's know a little bit more about what transpired during that night that Etch was killed. Just talk to that real quick, and then talk to the significance of an E9 being awarded the Medal of Honor.
Right. So they went up and they were there in the fall of '67, and immediately their missions were pretty successful. From their, they know they were hitting their targets. They didn't even know what they were. The coordinates come from somewhere else, and these guys were just leading the pilots to the place or whatever. But there was no surprise that these people were up there. The enemy's in the forest beneath them, maybe in onesies and twosies and things like that, and you're that close to North Vietnam. They knew that the Americans were up there already, probably by '65. So that wasn't any surprise. Plus, when they went up there and leveled off, I mean, you can imagine the explosions, the big helicopters that were carrying in their equipment. I mean, the North Vietnamese army was a professional army, right? I mean, they could see that and not just ignore it and be able to figure out that something had changed up on this peak. So the work went on, and through the fall and into the winter, and what happened was, while they were there, they knew that there was a road being built, like from North Vietnam, cut through the jungle, the woods, right? And they were it was coming straight at the mountain. Really, some people believe that they were like building that before the men even showed up there. They couldn't quite see it. So they knew that, and they would bomb. They'd call in bombing runs on the construction, to slow down the progress of the, because they're trying to get close enough where they can reach the peak with artillery. You're firing up a couple thousand feet or whatever. So they had that in the back of their mind the whole time. Besides the missions they were doing generally around Hanoi, they had that other issue with the that they were going to be attacked, which eventually they were. So the E9, very interesting to find. Chief Etchberger is the only E9 of any service to receive the Medal of Honor. It tends to go to young people. I mean, that's just the way it goes. So in the Air Force, at least, the next highest ranking person, even going back to the Army Air Forces in World War II, is 3 stripes below Chief Etchberger. So you've got your E5, your E6 is the staff NCOs, the ones that are doing the kind of the day-to-day operations. So by that time in anybody's career, like unless you're in special operations or something like that, and even like special operators, I wouldn't think that the E9s would be out there fighting that much or something. So Chief Etchberger was not a fighting person at all. I mean, he was a radar expert. He was a technical person. I mean, obviously they knew how to, they did the kind of the basic shooting skills and things like that. But he was up there because of his discipline and his. He knew everything about the system. He was an expert on it, and was a great help to the fairly young captain that was running the crew.
Well, speaking of that, in the book, there's a mention about having the special operators, the North Vietnamese Army leader of the team that actually scaled that face to attack this site, and he was interviewed at some point during a portion of our repatriation of parts and pieces of our fellow airmen.
Right.
So how did that impact, and what did any of his recollections play into writing of your book?
Well, I found that fascinating. That number one, I'm proud. I am so proud of that we do whatever we can to bring back our war dead. And so this gentleman was part of that team underneath the POW MIA accounting agency. I forget what it's called, but they do all the laboratory work is in Hawaii, and they have a presence in Washington D.C., I believe. So yeah, so we back in '94, we were starting to normalize relations with Vietnam, and they had welcomed us in, had a little office, and started reaching out, going out into the countryside and talking to people about, where aircraft had crashed or battles had been or something like that. And so, yeah, this one of the gentlemen on the team got to interview the guy that was he was a first lieutenant, I believe, for the NVA Special Forces, and who led that team up that cliff. So that cliff back then, you know, the radar guys show up and they're told, don't worry about that cliff. No one can come up that cliff. The other side of the mountain, it was kind of, you know, sloped. You could actually hike up it even if it was steep. That's where they had some local hires, you know, guns for hire sort of things, and some irregular forces or whatever. They were down there protecting the peak. Well, you know, this team ends up coming up that cliff, and so the fact that we had somebody go interview him, that guy ended up, he was a retired lieutenant colonel. He was a regular, you know, military officer. He didn't just get pulled into the war and then go back to his home or whatever. So he did that. So some people kind of didn't believe his whole, what he said was, you know, there was an attack, and then after the attack, the topsoil up there was only inches deep, and they couldn't bury the Americans that had been killed, so they threw the bodies off the cliff. Some people don't believe that. Some people believe that some were thrown off and other people were taken prisoner and all that. And that's a discussion for, that's way out. I mean, that's 50 years ago now. We're talking 50 and a half years ago now. So, so he said, you know, the Americans that we killed, 4 made it off the hill. The Americans that we killed, we threw their bodies off the cliff. Well, in 2005, we found some bone fragments where we identified the DNA for one of the men that was on there. It was down the cliff. And then in 2012, another one. They might have been found at the same time. They've visited that peak several times, but 50 years, now it's 50 years, so back then maybe 40 or 37 years of vegetation growth and stuff like that. They had to, they dig through that, and they were able to identify 2 of Chief Etchberger's comrades. So at least 2 of them were bodies were thrown off the cliff.
Thanks, Matt. Let's move on to some of the questions from the audience here. And here's one. It says, did you have to clear this book through any of the DoD agencies as far as security or any other?
The only thing I did early on, I thought, okay, well, see, the Air Force gave me the day off on Friday to go up to Chief Etchberger's hometown. And I thought, all the writing was done. Those 3 stories I wrote on my own time that fall, and we do that. It's no big deal. It's just quieter at home sometimes, something like that. So but then once I agreed to help Corey Etchberger with his book, I was in Germany for about 3 months, and I went to the legal office there, the JAG, Judge Advocate General's office. I said, I'm getting ready to write a book. Here's this. The Air Force gave me a day off. That's really it. They didn't pay me for my gas or anything. They just gave me a Friday. So I have a letter that said, you're golden. So no one's ever asked to see the letter, but I do say it's it. But early on, I did want to find out, because I didn't want to do anything wrong. So
obviously that the classification and the declassification of the project and everything else made it a little easier. You didn't have to go through all that.
Right. That was that had happened so many years in the past. Plus, the Air Force was talking about it openly. The funny thing was, when they told me to research it, it was just a possibility. Like the Air Force Times, which is, you know, a civilian publication that covers the Air Force, Marine Corps Times, the same thing. And so they did a whole big story on Chief Etchberger. But when I had my stories done, they said, I turned them in, and they said, "Oh, these are great. We can't run them though." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, we have to wait to see if he gets it." So the stories were done like 22 months early. And I said, "Well, somebody should have told me that." You know, they just said, "Yeah, well, because it would be embarrassing if we printed or published this on our website, and then the president decides not to give it to him." And I'm like, "But he still had the Air Force Cross. It's still worthy of a story series." But that was funny. Yeah. That's just bureaucracy.
There are 2 questions here from 2 separate people that are relatively the same. And the big question is, what, if any, security arrangements were in place at Lima 85? I mean, you kind of talked to it a little bit, right, but can you elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, not enough, obviously. those people came up that cliff. I'm not sure if they were using, you know, ropes, like technical climbing stuff like we would see now. Some people say, well, there's a little ridge that goes up it, and you can actually kind of walk. You know, it's a thin ridge, but you can maybe walk up it or something like that. But it was just dismissed. It wasn't. They never gave it any consideration that they had to worry about that at all. And yeah, so there was I think there was like, I mean, scores or maybe over 100 guards down on the approachable side. That's what they were worried about. But so I mean they planned, but that just wasn't in anybody's idea that you could climb up.
But it was primarily the security forces were primarily indigenous population that were guns for hire.
Tie regulars and that sort of thing.
Now that leads me to a next question that was asked here. A gentleman or someone wrote, were the indigenous PDJ tribesmen involved?
I believe so. Yes. The interaction between the Americans and them were very limited. The marching orders from the commander was, you don't go down there. Don't go down the hill at all. And there was a little trip down the hill one time, but they came up there and they basically stayed. So they would land. They would fly by helicopter from Udon, from Thailand, and they would land on this down by the Air America, the CIA's airstrip. There was 2 men generally working in that trailer, and they were about a quarter mile to a half a mile uphill from there. So they would get off the helicopter and go up there and go to work, and that's it.
Yeah, no interaction with the security forces at all?
Not much. Once in a while, they might bump into somebody down at the CIA trailer or something like that.
And this is probably the most important question. We really didn't cover much tonight, but someone asked, what happened to actually merit the Medal of Honor?
So they attacked. They got some warning that there was going to be an attack. You know, we had our own people down in there in onesies and twosies, you know, spying on them. They're spying on us and all that. So what happened was they knew there was going to be an attack at some point, and they were able to pinpoint. I don't even know how they do this. The intelligence was right on, but like in February of '68, they predicted they could sort of hold the peak until like March 11th, and I don't know how they did it, and that's really when the attack happened. So the Special Forces team that attacked marched like from I don't want to say from Hanoi, I don't know exactly where, but they didn't just march from the border. They had left like something like 10 days before the attack. I mean, they hiked alone through a small team just quietly, and got to that base of the cliff, and it was all part of a larger operation that had artillery support, and so what happened that night was their boss, they actually had increased. It was usually about 12 people there, and the day before, the commander sent more people up, even though they knew an attack was likely to happen. You know, you can always Monday morning quarterback it, but more people went up than had ever been on the hill. And that when the attack happened, there were 16 people, 12 of them got killed. But so they went up, and the ranking guy there was the deputy commander, a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Blanton. He's one of the ones his remains were found in either 2005 or 2012, I can't remember. But they were up there, and he got called down right about, their shifts were like 6 to 6, 12-hour shifts. And so he got called down to the CIA trailer, and the CIA told him they're massing forces down beneath where there's going to be an attack. And so he came up from the CIA trailer to the men. The 6 o'clock, you know, the day shift had just ended, and they were getting ready to eat. And they had a little barbecue and things like that. And so the guy that was a cook was sitting there getting ready to grill some steaks or something like that. And Colonel Blanton called everybody around, you know, called the men who were working out of the trailer and said, come on out here. He looks like we're gonna get an attack. So the men who were at the barbecue kind of came away from the barbecue. You know, there was the cook and about 2 or 3 guys hanging out with him, and they went over to hear what the colonel had to say. And right when he said that, a round came in and hit right at that barbecue. So if he hadn't called that meeting, there was 3 or 4 of the guys probably would have been killed right then. So that was about 6 o'clock at night. That was a signal to the people down below. That's what the came out in that interview we mentioned, that the American POW MIA guy interviewed the lieutenant colonel who led that mission. So they, that came in. So everyone went and grabbed their helmets and flak vests and all of that and their weapons, and then it got quiet. So I mean, it must have been everyone was shaken up, of course, and then they call up. But by that time, this was early March. By that time, it was already getting dark, like too dark to fly up any helicopters safely. So they took a vote, and said, well, you want to try to get out of here or wait till the morning? And they all said, wait till the morning, which is that other book I mentioned is called One Day Too Long. That's what he means, one day too long. If they would have left that night, they all would have survived. So they stayed, and then, so that first round came in about 6 p.m., and then some more fighting started. Nobody really knows the men. I mean, I interviewed 3 of the survivors, 2 of whom have since passed away, but they could never really agree on the time that stuff happened. It was midnight or 3 a.m. or whatever it was. Well, it was dark and it was late, but it was many hours after that first round had come in, and they started hearing some small arms fire down on where the guards were and stuff. Well, meanwhile, then that first round that came in was like a signal to the NVA Special Forces to start climbing the cliff, and so they did. They went up there and surprised our men. I mean, there was men working in the trailer. The other men were trying to sleep. I mean, I don't know if anyone actually slept that night, but they sort of divided up. Helicopters were going to come in the next morning at daybreak and pick them up. So what happened was Chief Etchberger and a couple of the other men, there was a little alcove at the top of that cliff, a little cutout, and 3 or 4 people could sit there, and guys might go down there for a smoke break and write their sweetheart or whatever. And well, that night, so a couple of guys went down there. And so if you can picture this, they're kind of on the top of the cliff, and then the trailers are up behind them, above them and behind them. And so they're down there when they hear small arms fire. I mean, close, right there. And you can imagine how frantic that was. Well, they had some weapons themselves, so they were trapped, basically kind of trapped down there. Unless they ran out right then to engage them. I mean, they didn't know what was going on. They didn't know if it was friendly forces shooting, the bad guys or what. They just didn't know. And so what happened was the working men in that trailer, some people say they just kind of got opened up on by the NVA just opening the door and firing. Other people believe, no, there was fighting. Eyewitnesses, American eyewitnesses said, no, there was some fighting that happened. One of the gentlemen who got killed got the Silver Star about 5 years ago, based on the recollection. But so what Chief Etchberger did especially was the NVA eventually found them, knew that there was men down there, and they couldn't fight. I mean, they were on this ledge. They couldn't see anything. They could, kind of shoot up into the sky and create noise or something, but they couldn't actually fire with any sort of thought. And so what happened was that the enemy saw them, knew they were there, and lobbed down some hand grenades. And so there was 5 men, I believe 4 men and Chief Etchberger. 2 of the men were killed very quickly by the hand grenades, and then 2 men were injured severely. One of them was still alive. Tech Sergeant John Daniel lives in Colorado, and he was injured severely. Took him over a year to recover. And so what Chief did was he had M16s were pretty new then, but they had received some some weapons in January to defend themselves about this, possible attack. And so Chief wasn't injured. I mean, those hand grenades came down and blew up right near him, killed two of his men, and injured 2 others, and he didn't have a scratch on him. And so he, they had a radio, and they were able to report what was happening. And but again, it's the middle of the night, and you were kind of waiting for daybreak, kind of just trying to survive till daybreak at that point. And so Chief Etchberger was able to engage a guard coming down at one point and kill him, maybe more than one at that point. So he's protecting those survivors. 2 men are dead, 2 men are alive, seriously wounded. So the rescue Air Force, there was two sets of, there was Air America helicopter pilots in Huey's and the Air Force rescue pilots in Jolly Greens. They were coming from, who was saying, Nacon, who was talking about that? You. Right, yeah, so they were coming from there. So what happened was the pilot on the Air America crew, this gentleman's still alive down in Texas. He'd been in the Army and he was working for Air America then. He just happened to be very close, maybe 15 miles away at another Lima site. And in those days, it was one pilot and then the crew chief, guy out back, who had an AK-47. But they were at this other place. Now we're talking about daybreak now. So the attack has happened, and Chief Etchberger's been trying to tend to the 2 injured men. And so at daybreak, they come over. They hear some chatter on their radio, and they're asking a guy who's helping with the fuel, what's going on? He said, oh, there was an attack over at Lima Site 85. And actually, the crew chief had been there the day before with a different pilot. They mixed up. The pilots would fly with different people and everything. And he had been there the previous day, and he said, oh yeah, they were expecting an attack. And they said, well, the fuel guy said, well, they got it. So they said, well, let's go see if we can help. And so I set their little directional finder, and the guy described it for me. He makes a little weep, weep, weep thing, and he says, oh yeah, pointing right at the radio transmission. So they went over. They happened to be, they weren't the first helicopter crew there, but they were the first helicopter crew that had a hoist. And so there were some other ones there and said, who has a hoister? And they said, us, and I forget the call sign, but they said, well, you got it. So they flew in, and now Chief Etchberger's down there on the ground, not on the ground, but on that alcove, on the cliff, at the top of the cliff, and they negotiate that helicopter in there, and they're taking some small arms fire, not as much as you would kind of expect at that point, but they also had some air support had already gone in there, and the NVA were kind of hiding in the rocks to get away from the bombs being dropped on them by that point. So, but the helicopter at first, I think, had pretty clear approach at least. Well, then as they got close, they started taking some small arms fire. So they lowered this cable down, and at the end of it, it's got it's called the jungle penetrator. It opens up. It's almost like petals on a flower, but they're metal, and they can 2 or 3 men can get on it. So Chief Etchberger, who doesn't have a scratch on him, he gets the 2 injured men one at a time. One goes up. He gets them on there. They hoist that person up, send it back down. He gets the other person on. He goes back up. Meanwhile, he's firing his weapon to trying to create some distraction. Well, there was also 2 other men who at a different part, 2 other Americans had survived. One was injured, and they were separate from each other. They were in hiding the previous, 5 hours or so. So what Chief Etchberger doesn't know is going to happen, he starts smashing like up to N16 so the enemy can't use them. And then at one point, this one guy sees the helicopter. You can imagine this. That's my way off the hill. And he comes running. And he actually passed another man who was injured, who couldn't run. He says, get up. And he says, I can't. My legs hurt. And then the guy leaves him. And he says, don't let him leave me. And then so this guy who really doesn't have a scratch on him either comes running around the corner. And Chief Etchberger almost shot him. He didn't know. The guy came around, and he's there. You know, was surprised to see another one of his men there, and then the two of them got on the hoist together. So Chief Etchberger tended to the first two guys, the injured guys, got them up separately into the helicopter, and then goes up with this sergeant, and they ride up together, and they get on the helicopter, and they're still taking some fire. And then when they get on the helicopter, the one gentleman who had come running and saw the injured guy went up to the front to tell the pilot, hey, there's an injured man up there still. And he put that out on the radio, and got, they did come get him. You know, maybe 15 minutes or 30 minutes later, they got him. That was an Air Force crew that came in and got that guy. So this is two Air America people doing all this stuff. And they, so Chief Etchberger got on the helicopter, and probably, you know, breathed a sigh of relief. He was on it, and unfortunately, tragically, they were firing at the helicopter, and a round went up through the bottom of the helicopter and went into his gut, and he died probably within the next 2 to 5 minutes, and had made it on there without a scratch on him. And by the time they landed back, the Air America crew back at that other Lima site where they had taken off from, you know, you're in the middle of nowhere. He needed surgery. He didn't need they just weren't prepared to deal with that whatsoever. They had a first aid kit on there, but he needed to be in surgery, and he was gone by the time they landed back to where they had taken off. And that pilot, he lives in Houston, he said, I asked him, from the time you left that Lima site, went there and did that, until the time you got back to that Lima site, how long was that? And I think he told me like 20 minutes. Yeah, so all that happened in that short of a time frame. And then the injured and Chief Etchberger's body were put on another plane, and they took off and brought back to Thailand, and they never saw these people again, and they started reconnecting, you know, 40 years later.
Well, thanks, Matt. Once again, that's a great story. It's a great book for those who haven't read it. You're going to have an opportunity here in a few minutes to chat with Matt, because he's brought some along to sign, if you're interested. I highly recommend you read it. It's a quick read. It's a great story. And it's something that my era Air Force guys knew about a little bit. And to see him get an Air Force Cross upgraded to a Medal of Honor is a pretty amazing story to think about it 42 years later after this highly classified. I know I missed a few questions from folks, but let's leave that until after this portion, and we'll go to the informal side on the side.
Great.
What else? Anything else? Thank you, Matt, for being here.
I don't have anything else. Thank you.